They offered weary travelers warm beds and full plates. But by sunrise, no one ever left. In the heart of Missouri, an inn built on kindness was hiding something far darker than hunger. Thomas Ashford had always been drawn to forgotten places, which made his work as an estate liquidator both profitable and deeply satisfying. The musty smell of abandoned attics and the weight of unclaimed histories filled him with a peculiar sense of purpose that his ex-wife Sarah had never understood. On this particular October morning in 2019, he found himself standing in the cluttered parlor of the Whitmore estate, a crumbling Victorian mansion on the outskirts of Salem, Oregon, that had been sealed for nearly 40 years following the death of its last inhabitant, Ezra Whitmore. The house groaned under the weight of accumulated decades, its wallpaper peeling like old skin, and its floorboards sagging beneath layers of dust and neglect. Thomas methodically worked through room after room, cataloging antiques, sorting through correspondence, and boxing up the detritus of a life lived in increasing solitude. Ezra Whitmore had been something of a local eccentric, a retired professor of American history who had spent his final years obsessively collecting Civil War memorabilia and frontier artifacts. The basement alone contained enough military buttons, cavalry sabers, and faded daguerreotypes to stock a small museum. It was in Ezra's study, behind a false panel that Thomas discovered purely by accident when he leaned against the wrong section of wainscoting, that he found the leather portfolio. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth and protected by layers of tissue paper, lay a single daguerreotype in remarkably pristine condition. The image showed a 2-story wooden building with a wraparound porch, clearly an inn or boarding house from the mid-1800s. A painted sign above the front door read, "Hollowbrook Inn, Lodging and Meals." But it wasn't the building itself that made Thomas's breath catch in his throat. It was the 2 men standing proudly in front of it. The brothers appeared to be in their 30s, both tall and lean with dark hair and piercing eyes that seemed to stare directly through the camera lens, with an intensity that was almost predatory. The older brother, positioned slightly forward, wore a black suit with a silver watch chain, his hand resting possessively on the inn's porch railing. The younger brother stood in the shadows of the doorway, his face partially obscured, but his smile visible, a cold, calculating expression that sent an inexplicable chill down Thomas's spine. Written in faded ink on the photograph's mounting board were the names Marcus and Silas Hollowbrook, Missouri Territory, 1884, and below that, in a different hand, the last photograph ever taken. Thomas turned the mounting board over and found a newspaper clipping pasted to the back, yellow and brittle with age. The headline read, "Mysterious Disappearances Plague Frontier Inn. Dozens of travelers vanish without trace." The article, dated September 15, 1884, from the Independence Ledger, described how guests at the remote Hollowbrook Inn had been disappearing with alarming frequency over the past 2 years. Witnesses reported seeing travelers arrive, but never saw them depart. Local authorities had begun investigating, but the inn's isolated location and the brothers' reputation for hospitality had initially deflected suspicion. As Thomas read further, his hands began to tremble slightly. The article mentioned that Marcus and Silas Hollowbrook had inherited the inn from their uncle and had transformed it from a struggling way station into what appeared to be a thriving business. They were known for their generous meals and comfortable accommodations, often charging less than their competitors, and sometimes waiving fees entirely for travelers who appeared to be down on their luck. The brothers claimed that many of their guests were transients, heading west who simply chose to continue their journeys without settling their bills. But the sheer number of disappearances had Thomas sat in Ezra's worn leather chair, the daguerreotype in his lap, and felt the familiar tug of a mystery that demanded investigation. His successful career had been built on understanding the stories behind objects, on recognizing when something was more than it appeared to be. This photograph, hidden away for decades, practically screamed with secrets. The intensity in the brother's eyes, the ominous final line about it being the last photograph ever taken, and the accompanying newspaper clipping all pointed to a story that had. He spent the next hour searching through Ezra's papers, looking for any additional information about the Hollowbrook Inn or its proprietors, but found nothing else. However, he did discover Ezra's extensive research notes on frontier crimes and unsolved mysteries of the American West. The professor had clearly been fascinated by the darker aspects of westward expansion, particularly cases involving missing persons and suspected foul play. Thomas began to understand that finding this particular daguerreotype had not been coincidence. Ezra had been hunting for it. That evening, Thomas returned to his apartment with the photograph and spent hours examining it under different lighting conditions, using a magnifying glass to study every detail. The more he looked, the more disturbed he became. There was something wrong with the inn itself. Shadows fell at impossible angles, and what he had initially taken for decorative elements around the porch began to look more like stains. Dark patches on the building's walls that couldn't be explained by normal weathering. Most unsettling of all, he began to notice other figures in the photograph, partially hidden in windows and doorways. Faces that seemed to watch from the darkness inside the inn. Thomas had always prided himself on being rational, skeptical of anything that couldn't be explained by facts and evidence. But as he stared at the daguerreotype that night, he couldn't shake the feeling that the Hollowbrook brothers were staring back at him, their cold smiles promising secrets that perhaps were better left buried. He found himself researching frontier inns online until well past midnight, learning about the isolated way stations that had served travelers along dangerous routes, and how easy it would have been for unscrupulous proprietors to prey upon vulnerable guests. The next morning, Thomas made a decision that would change his life forever. Instead of simply cataloging the daguerreotype with the rest of Ezra's collection, he would investigate the story of the Hollowbrook Inn himself. He had vacation time accumulated, contacts in historical societies across the country, and enough curiosity to drive him halfway across the continent if necessary. The photograph had awakened something in him that had been dormant for years, a sense of purpose that went beyond mere profit, a need to uncover truth, no matter how dark it might prove to be. The breakthrough came when Thomas contacted Dr. Margaret Chen, a historian at the University of Missouri, who specialized in frontier crime. Dr. Chen had heard whispers of the Hollowbrook case throughout her career, but had never been able to locate substantial documentation. When Thomas described the daguerreotype and shared high-resolution scans, her excitement was palpable. She agreed to meet him in Columbia, Missouri, and together they would travel to the approximate location where the inn had once stood. Dr. Chen had been working on a book about unsolved mysteries of the American frontier, and the Hollowbrook Inn represented one of her most compelling cold cases. As he carefully wrapped the daguerreotype and placed it in his briefcase, Thomas couldn't have known that his decision to investigate would lead him down a path of discovery that would challenge everything he thought he knew about evil, about justice, and about the price of curiosity. The brothers in the photograph seemed to mock him with their eternal smiles, as if they had been waiting more than a century for someone foolish enough to come looking for them. What really happened at Hollowbrook Inn, and why was this the last photograph ever taken? Thomas's research began in earnest at the Oregon State Archives, where he spent 3 days poring over digitized newspaper collections and frontier records. The trail of the Hollowbrook Inn proved surprisingly elusive. Mentions were scattered and often contradictory, as if the story had been deliberately obscured over time. He found references in territorial records to a Hollowbrook station along the western Missouri route, but official documentation was sparse. What he did discover painted an increasingly disturbing picture of systematic disappearances that had terrorized travelers for nearly 3 years, before abruptly ending in late 1884. Their first stop was the Jackson County Historical Society, housed in a restored 1800s courthouse in Independence. The Society's archives contained the original files from the 1884 investigation, material that had never been digitized or widely circulated. Thomas felt his pulse quicken as the elderly archivist, Mrs. Eleanor Fitzpatrick, laid out boxes of yellowed documents, photographs, and witness statements. The story that emerged was far more horrific than the newspaper clippings had suggested. According to the investigation files, the disappearances at Hollowbrook Inn had followed a disturbing pattern. Travelers would arrive, usually alone or in small groups, and would be seen checking in by other guests or local residents. The brothers would serve them dinner, often inviting them to stay longer than originally planned, due to supposed bad weather or dangerous road conditions ahead. However, these guests would never be seen again. When questioned, Marcus and Silas would claim their guests had departed early in the morning, before dawn, eager to continue their westward journey. The investigation had been triggered by a wealthy merchant named Hamilton Cross, whose son Edward had disappeared while traveling to California in the spring of 1884. Unlike many of the previous victims, Edward Cross had family with resources and connections, who refused to accept the brothers' explanations. Hamilton Cross hired private investigators and eventually convinced territorial authorities to conduct a formal inquiry. What they discovered had shocked even hardened frontier lawmen. Thomas read through the witness statements with growing horror. A former employee of the inn, a young woman named Rebecca Walsh, who had worked briefly as a kitchen maid, testified that she had seen Marcus and Silas dragging what appeared to be bodies from guest rooms to the inn's cellar during the night. She claimed to have heard screams from beneath the floorboards and had discovered bloodstains on bedding that the brothers burned in the courtyard. Rebecca had fled the inn after only 2 weeks, terrified for her own safety, but had been too frightened to speak out until the official investigation began. Dr. Chen pointed to a map included in the files, showing the exact location of the inn along what had been known as the Westport Trail. The building had stood approximately 30 miles southeast of Independence, in a remote valley that provided perfect isolation for the brothers' activities. According to the investigation, when authorities finally arrived at the inn in October 1884, they found the building abandoned. Marcus and Silas Hollowbrook had vanished, leaving behind a structure that contained evidence of horrific crimes. The most chilling document in the file was the report from the territorial marshal who had led the excavation of the inn's cellar and surrounding grounds. Thomas read with mounting revulsion as the marshal described finding the remains of at least 37 individuals buried beneath the inn's floorboards and scattered around the property. Many showed signs of violent death, crushed skulls, knife wounds, evidence of dismemberment. Personal effects found with the bodies matched descriptions of missing travelers dating back nearly 3 years. But it was the marshal's final observation that made Thomas's blood run cold. According to the report, the kitchen of the inn contained evidence that the brothers had been butchering human remains and serving them to guests. Bone fragments found in the cooking areas, specialized knives designed for breaking down large carcasses, and most damning of all, a guest ledger that contained notes in Marcus Hollowbrook's handwriting describing the quality of various victims, and which parts would be most suitable for different meals. The brothers had not simply been robbing and murdering their guests. They had been cannibalizing them and feeding them to subsequent victims. Dr. Chen's face had gone pale as they read through the documents together. "This explains why the case was buried," she said quietly. "The territorial government would have wanted to prevent panic. The idea that travelers could be served their predecessors as dinner would have destroyed confidence in frontier hospitality entirely." She showed Thomas a final document, a confidential memo from the territorial governor, ordering that all details of cannibalism be suppressed in official reports, and that the inn be burned to the ground, and the land marked as unsuitable for development. That evening, in their hotel in Independence, Thomas and Dr. Chen compared the investigation files with the daguerreotype. The timeline was crucial. The photograph had been taken in early September 1884, just weeks before the investigation began, and the brothers disappeared. Dr. Chen pointed out details in the image that took on new significance. The darkness visible through the inn's windows wasn't empty space, but could be concealing victims or evidence. The stains on the building's exterior walls were likely bloodstains that had seeped through the wood. Most disturbing of all, what Thomas had initially interpreted as decorative elements around the porch were actually tools, hooks, pulleys, and chains that would have been used for processing carcasses. The next morning they drove to the location where the inn had once stood. The valley was now part of a state conservation area, heavily wooded and accessible only by hiking trail. As they made their way through the forest, Dr. Chen explained that the land had never been developed, partly due to the official designation as unsuitable, and partly due to local superstitions about the area being cursed. Even today, hunters and hikers reported feeling uneasy in the valley, though few knew the historical reasons for their discomfort. They found the site after nearly 2 hours of searching, guided by Dr. Chen's GPS coordinates and the marshal's detailed description of landmarks. The foundation stones of the inn were still visible, partially covered by decades of fallen leaves and undergrowth. Thomas knelt beside the remnants of what had been the main entrance, imagining the dozens of unsuspecting travelers who had walked through that doorway to their deaths. The silence in the valley was oppressive, broken only by the whisper of wind through bare branches. Dr. Chen began taking photographs and measurements while Thomas explored the surrounding area. It was near what would have been the inn's kitchen that he found the first bone, yellowed with age and partially embedded in the forest floor. Then another, and another. Despite the official excavation more than a century earlier, evidence of the brothers' crimes still littered the ground. Thomas felt sick as he realized he was walking through what amounted to a mass grave, a killing field where human beings had been reduced to components for the brothers' grotesque business model. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Thomas and Dr. Chen prepared to leave the site. The weight of what they had discovered pressed down on both of them. The daguerreotype he had found was not simply a historical curiosity, but evidence of one of the most horrific serial killing cases in American history. The brothers' crimes had been so shocking that they had been effectively erased from public memory, buried along with their victims beneath the Missouri soil. Walking back through the forest, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every shadow seemed to contain figures. Every sound suggested footsteps following them through the undergrowth. The rational part of his mind dismissed these sensations as psychological responses to the disturbing revelations of the day. But the primitive part of his brain that had kept his ancestors alive whispered warnings about lingering evil and restless spirits. That night, back in their hotel, Thomas stared at the daguerreotype with new understanding. The brothers' predatory smiles now seemed like advertisements for their lethal hospitality. The shadows in the inn's windows could be hiding victims in various stages of captivity or processing. The photograph was not just a record of the inn's existence, but a trophy of their success, a memento of their perfect crime that had operated undetected for years. Now I understand why this was the last photograph ever taken. Within weeks, their empire of horror would be exposed, and they would vanish forever into the American wilderness. The revelation that would change everything came 3 days later, when Dr. Chen called Thomas with trembling excitement in her voice. She had been following up on genealogical records, trying to trace what had happened to Marcus and Silas Hollowbrook after they disappeared from the inn. What she had discovered defied belief and transformed their understanding of the entire case. The brothers had not simply vanished into the frontier wilderness. They had assumed new identities and continued their deadly practices for decades, spawning a legacy of murder that had persisted well into the 20th century. Thomas drove immediately to Dr. Chen's office at the university, where she had spread genealogical charts, census records, and newspaper clippings across every available surface. Her research had uncovered a pattern of suspicious deaths and disappearances that followed a trail westward from Missouri, through Kansas and Colorado, and eventually to California. The Hollowbrook brothers had perfected their technique of assuming new identities, establishing seemingly respectable businesses that catered to travelers, and systematically murdering their customers. "Look at this, Doctor," Chen said, pointing to an 1892 newspaper article from Denver. The Riverside Hotel fire that killed proprietors Martin and Samuel Holbrook. Noticed the similarity in names. Witnesses said the fire started in the cellar, and when investigators sifted through the ruins, they found human remains that couldn't be accounted for by the guest registry. The case was ruled an accident, but the pattern matches perfectly. She showed Thomas similar incidents in Colorado Springs, Santa Fe, and finally Los Angeles, where the trail ended in 1903 with the mysterious disappearance of 2 hotel owners during a police investigation. But the most shocking discovery was yet to come. Dr. Chen had traced the brothers' family lineage and found that their methods had been passed down through generations. Marcus Hollowbrook had fathered 3 children before disappearing from Missouri, and Silas had 2 sons. These descendants had scattered across the American West, but many had established businesses that served travelers, boarding houses, restaurants, trading posts. And wherever they settled, unexplained disappearances seemed to follow. Thomas felt the familiar chill as Dr. Chen showed him a photograph from 1923, taken at a remote desert trading post in Nevada. 3 men stood outside the building, their faces bearing an unmistakable resemblance to the original Hollowbrook brothers. The same predatory eyes, the same calculating smiles, the same sense of barely contained malevolence. The accompanying newspaper article described the mysterious disappearance of 6 prospectors who had been seen entering the trading post, but never emerged. "It gets worse, Doctor," Chen continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've found evidence suggesting the family maintained contact with each other, sharing techniques and even moving victims between locations. They created a network of killing stations across the West, all disguised as legitimate businesses serving travelers. The scope of their crimes is almost incomprehensible. We're potentially looking at hundreds of victims over more than 50 years. The most disturbing revelation came when Dr. Chen showed Thomas a collection of photographs she had discovered in a private estate sale in California. The photos had been part of a trunk belonging to a man named Marcos Holbrook Jr., who had died in 1954. The images showed multiple generations of the family gathered for what appeared to be celebrations or reunions. But these were not ordinary family gatherings. The photographs contained evidence of their ongoing crimes. Tables laden with suspicious cuts of meat, victims' personal belongings displayed as trophies, and most horrifically, formal portraits of family members posed with human remains. Thomas studied the photographs with growing revulsion and fascination. The family had not simply inherited the brothers' murderous tendencies. They had elevated them to a ritualistic level. Each generation had refined the techniques, expanded the operation, and celebrated their success with increasingly elaborate ceremonies. The original daguerreotype he had found was not just evidence of the Hollowbrook Inn's crimes, but the founding document of a multi-generational murder cult. Dr. Chen had also uncovered evidence that the family had kept detailed records of their activities, account books listing victims by name, physical characteristics, and assessments of their suitability. Maps showing the locations of burial sites across multiple states. Most chilling of all, family recipes that included human meat as ingredients, passed down through generations like any other cooking tradition. The Hollowbrooks had transformed cannibalism from desperate survival into a sophisticated culinary practice. The investigation took on new urgency when Dr. Chen discovered that the family line had not ended in the 1950s, as she had initially believed. Census records and property deeds suggested that descendants were still alive, still operating businesses that catered to travelers in remote locations. The realization that the Hollowbrook legacy might continue to claim victims in the present day sent both researchers into a state of barely controlled panic. Thomas found himself obsessed with tracing the family's current activities. He spent sleepless nights scouring online databases, cross-referencing missing persons reports with businesses owned by anyone with variations of the Hollowbrook name. What he found was a pattern of modern disappearances that seemed to center around a chain of truck stops and diners along remote interstate highways. The establishments were owned by a corporation that, when traced through multiple shell companies, led back to individuals whose genealogy connected them directly to Marcus and Silas Hollowbrook. The breakthrough came when Thomas discovered a contemporary photograph posted on the website of a truck stop in rural Nevada called the Desert Rose Diner. The image showed the current owner, a man named Mark Holbrook, standing beside his establishment with the same predatory smile that had haunted Thomas since he first found the daguerreotype. The resemblance to the original brothers was unmistakable. The same lean build, the same intense eyes, the same aura of barely contained menace. Dr. Chen's research revealed that Mark Holbrook's diner had been the last known location of at least 12 missing truck drivers over the past 5 years. The drivers had all been traveling alone, hauling freight across long-distance routes, and had contacted their dispatchers from the Desert Rose before vanishing completely. Local authorities had investigated, but found no evidence of foul play, accepting Holbrook's explanations that the drivers had simply chosen to abandon their routes and disappear into the desert. The parallels to the original Hollowbrook Inn were impossible to ignore. an isolated location serving travelers, a proprietor with the family name and physical characteristics, and a pattern of customers who arrived but never left. Thomas realized that he and Dr. Chen had uncovered not just a historical mystery, but an ongoing series of crimes that had persisted for more than 130 years. The daguerreotype had led them to the discovery of what might be America's longest-running serial-killing dynasty. As Thomas prepared to contact federal authorities with their findings, he made one final discovery that changed everything. Hidden in the back of one of the family photographs was a small piece of paper with an address written in pencil. The address was in Oregon, less than 50 miles from where Thomas lived. Further research revealed that the property was owned by Sarah Holbrook Ashford, a woman who had married into the Hollowbrook family in the 1980s and had been running a bed and breakfast, catering to hikers and travelers, exploring the Oregon wilderness. The name Ashford hit Thomas like a physical blow. His ex-wife, Sarah, had often mentioned a distant relative who owned a charming inn in the mountains, someone she had visited during their marriage, but whom Thomas had never met. The timing aligned perfectly. Sarah had inherited money from this relative's estate just before their divorce, money that had allowed her to move to Colorado and start her new life. Thomas felt his world tilt as he realized that the Hollowbrook family's web of murder had somehow entangled his own life, that his ex-wife might be connected to or even complicit in the ongoing crimes. The phone rang in Dr. Chen's office, breaking the terrified silence that had settled over both researchers. It was Sarah, Thomas's ex-wife, calling him for the first time in 3 years. Her voice was sweet and concerned as she asked about his current work, mentioned that she had heard he was investigating some old family history. She suggested they meet for dinner to catch up on old times, perhaps at a quiet little place she knew in the mountains. As Thomas listened to her familiar voice, he realized with crystalline clarity that his discovery of the daguerreotype had not been coincidence. It had been orchestrated. Sarah knew I would find that photograph, and now she's coming to finish what her family started more than a century ago. Dr. Chen was placed in witness protection after the discovery that she too had been marked for elimination. The family had been monitoring her research into frontier crimes for years, waiting for her to get close enough to the truth to become a liability. Her enthusiastic collaboration with Thomas had accelerated their timeline for dealing with both researchers. Only the rapid intervention of federal agents had prevented their murders. The trial of the surviving Hollowbrook family members became a media sensation, exposing the existence of America's most successful serial-killing dynasty. Mark Holbrook, the owner of the Desert Rose Diner, was convicted of 17 counts of first-degree murder, with evidence suggesting he had personally killed more than 40 people over his 15-year career. Sarah received a life sentence despite her cooperation, her role in recruiting victims and disposing of evidence making her an equal partner in the family's crimes. The investigation revealed that the original daguerreotype was one of several photographs taken in September 1884, all intended as documentation of the brothers' successful operation. The photographer, a traveling portraitist named William Crane, had become suspicious of the brothers' activities and had attempted to blackmail them. He became their final victim at the original inn, his death triggering the investigation that forced Marcus and Silas to abandon their operation and assume new identities. Thomas struggled with the psychological aftermath of learning that his entire adult life had been orchestrated by murderers. His marriage, his career choices, even his apartment location, had been influenced by the family's long-term planning. Therapy helped him understand that he had been a victim rather than a collaborator. But the knowledge that he had been living inside a conspiracy for years left him fundamentally changed. The daguerreotype itself became crucial evidence in the federal case, its discovery leading to the exposure of the entire network. Thomas donated it to the Smithsonian Institution, where it became part of an exhibit on American crime history. Standing before the display case, he reflected on how a single photograph had contained the seeds of its creator's destruction, waiting more than a century for the right person to recognize its significance and follow the trail of evidence to its logical conclusion. 6 months after the raids, Thomas received a letter from Agent Rodriguez informing him that the investigation had identified 412 confirmed victims of the Hollowbrook family, with evidence suggesting the actual number might exceed 600. The family's criminal network had generated millions of dollars in profits over the decades, money that was being seized and distributed to victims' families through a federal compensation fund. The letter also contained news that brought Thomas a measure of peace. The remains of William Crane, the photographer who had taken the original daguerreotype, had been identified among the bodies discovered at the Missouri site. Crane's camera and equipment, buried with him in 1884, had been recovered and would be displayed alongside the photograph as a testament to his role in ultimately bringing the killers to justice. Thomas returned to his work as an Tate liquidator, but with a new appreciation for the stories that objects could tell, and the responsibility that came with uncovering buried truths. He established a foundation dedicated to investigating cold cases and supporting the families of missing persons, using his skills and resources to ensure that other secrets would not remain hidden for more than a century. On the anniversary of finding the daguerreotype, Thomas visited the site of the original Hollowbrook Inn, now marked with a memorial to the victims. Standing in the quiet valley where so much horror had occurred, he reflected on the strange justice that had allowed a photograph taken by a doomed man to survive long enough to expose his killers and their descendants. The faces of Marcus and Silas Hollowbrook no longer haunted him with their predatory smiles. They had become historical artifacts, reminders of evil defeated and justice finally served. The last photograph ever taken had become the first piece of evidence in the longest murder investigation in American history, proving that some secrets are too terrible to stay buried forever.